The hum of machinery filled the air at Collins Manufacturing, a sprawling factory on the edge of town where steel clanged and sparks flew like a gritty symphony. Richard Collins stepped through the back gate, his 58-year-old frame hunched under a faded work jacket, a scratched-up helmet pulled low over his graying hair. He blended into the morning shift, just another face in the crowd of tired workers shuffling in with their lunch pails. No one gave him a second look, not the young guys with earbuds, not the old-timers with creaky knees. But Richard wasn't here to punch a clock. He was the CEO, the man who'd built this place from a single warehouse into an industrial giant. And today, he was undercover, chasing a hunch that had been gnawing at him for weeks. It started with the reports numbers too good to be true. Production up 20%, costs down, profits climbing like a rocket. Richard had spent decades preaching that people were the heart of Collins Manufacturing, not just cogs in a machine, but lately he'd been stuck in boardrooms, shaking hands with shareholders, signing off on deals. The factory felt like a distant memory, a place he'd left behind for spreadsheets and suits. Then came the whispers, rumors of burnout, unpaid overtime, a manager running the floor like a dictator. So he ditched the tie, swapped his loafers for steel-toed boots, and slipped in as Rick, a new hire nobody questioned. He needed to see it for himself, to make sure his promises still held weight. The shift kicked off with a jolt. Richard lined up at the assembly belt, the clang of metal drowning out the chatter as he fumbled with a wrench, playing the part. Across the floor, Martha, wiry 62-year-old with hands tough as leather worked the line like she'd been born to it. She'd been with Collins since the early days, back when Richard was still hauling crates himself. But now her shoulders sagged, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Halfway through the morning, she stumbled, clutching the edge of a machine to steady herself, her breath coming in short gasps. Richard froze, his wrench slipping in his grip, as Mark Jensen, the floor manager, stormed over, his clipboard swinging like a weapon. "Get it together, Martha," Mark barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're old, not dead yet. Can't hack it, then get out." The words hit Richard like a punch, his jaw tightening under the helmet. Martha straightened, her hands shaking as she nodded, too worn to argue. Mark, 45, broad-shouldered, with a smirk that said he owned the place, didn't even blink, just turned back to his clipboard, barking orders at the next guy down the line. Richard's blood simmered, but he kept his head down, his eyes darting around. The younger workers flinched under Mark's glare, their faces blank, their hands moving fast to avoid his wrath. This wasn't hustle, this was fear. By noon, the truth was staring him in the face. Mark called a huddle, his voice booming over the whine of the machines. "Overtime tonight mandatory. No pay bumps, no whining. You don't like it, there's the door." A murmur rippled through the crew, but no one spoke up. Martha coughed, a dry, hacking sound, and Mark shot her a look that could have curdled milk. "You're on cleanup too," he snapped. "Earn your keep." She nodded again, her eyes dull, and Richard's fists clenched under the workbench. He'd seen enough in 6 hours to know this wasn't just a bad day, this was a system, a machine grinding people down while he'd been busy signing checks. His factory, his name, his promises, all getting trampled under Mark's boots. The brake whistle blew, and the crew scattered, some to the cafeteria, some just collapsing where they stood. Richard lingered, watching Martha sink onto a crate, her hands trembling as she unwrapped a sandwich. He wanted to march over, to demand answers, but Rick couldn't do that, not yet. He'd come to check on his people, to see if the heart of Collins Manufacturing still beat like he'd built it to. Instead, he'd found a nightmare, a place where loyalty like Martha's got spat on and hard work got you a shove out the door. What the hell had happened here? And how long could he stand by, playing the quiet new guy, while the empire he'd poured his life into tore itself apart from the inside? The air in Collins Manufacturing hung heavy with grease and tension, the relentless clang of machinery pounding through the factory floor like a heartbeat on edge. Richard Collins stood at his spot on the assembly line, his borrowed work gloves slick with sweat, his helmet shadowing the fury brewing in his 58-year-old eyes. He'd come in as Rick, the new guy, expecting to find a few cracks in the system, maybe some lazy oversight, a manager cutting corners. But after a day under Mark Jensen's reign, he was staring down a full-blown disaster. The workers around him moved like ghosts, heads down, hands fast, voices hushed while Mark strutted the floor like a king, his clipboard a scepter he wielded with a sneer. Richard kept his cover tight, fumbling with bolts and nodding at the gruff instructions from the guy next to him, a kid barely 20 who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Across the line, Martha shuffled through her tasks, her 62-year-old frame bent under the weight of exhaustion. She'd been here since the beginning, back when Richard was still dreaming up this place over beers with his old man. But now she was a shadow, her hands trembling as she tightened screws. He'd caught her popping aspirin during the break, wincing like every move hurt, and it gnawed at him deep, sharp, personal. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was his legacy, his people, and Mark was grinding them into the dirt. The afternoon dragged on, and Mark's temper flared hotter. He stomped over to a cluster of older workers, barking about quotas like they were dogs who'd missed a trick. "Pick it up, or you're out," he snapped, his voice echoing off the steel walls. Richard's jaw clenched, but he stayed quiet, playing the part, watching as Martha fumbled a part and dropped it with a clatter. She bent to grab it, her breath ragged, and before she could straighten, Mark was on her. "What's this, nap time?" he yelled, loud enough to turn heads. "You're slowing us down. You old hag, move it, or hit the road." Martha flinched, nodding fast, her face pale as she scrambled back to work. Richard's hands tightened on his wrench, the metal biting into his palm. He wanted to deck the bastard right there, but Rick couldn't swing, had to dig deeper. By late shift, it got worse. Martha's knees buckled as she hauled a crate, and she went down hard, her gasp lost in the roar of the machines. Richard lunged forward instinctively, catching her arm before she hit the floor, but the other workers froze, their eyes darting to Mark. He stormed over, his face red, his boots slamming the concrete. "Get up. Martha, no one's carrying your weight here," he snarled. She tried, her arms shaking, but couldn't manage it. Richard held her steady, his voice low but firm. "She needs a break, anyone can see that." Mark wheeled on him, sizing up the new guy with a sneer. "Who the hell are you to talk? Mind your own damn business, or you're next out the door." The air crackled, the crew holding its breath. Richard straightened, his heart pounding, but he bit back the fire roaring in his chest. "Just saying she's hurt," he muttered, keeping his tone rough, unpolished. "Rick, not Richard." Mark laughed, a short, ugly sound, and waved him off. "She's fine, old folks, always whine. Back to work, all of you." No one moved to help Martha, not even the kid next to Richard, who shot him a quick, scared look before turning away. Richard eased her to a stool, his hands shaking with rage as she whispered a faint thanks. Mark didn't call for help, didn't even glance back, just kept barking orders, the crew scrambling to obey. Richard's gut twisted. This wasn't a factory, it was a damn prison camp. That night, the overtime kicked in and the real ugliness showed. Mark paced the floor, his voice a whip cracking over the hum of the belts. 12 hours today, no breaks. You want to eat? Do it standing. Anyone walks, don't bother coming back. The younger workers groaned under their breath, but the older ones, Martha, a guy with a limp, a woman with gray streaks, sagged like they'd heard it too many times. Richard watched, his notepad tucked inside his jacket, every barked order and trembling hand etched into his memory. He'd seen enough to fire Mark on the spot, but he needed more proof. Names, something the board couldn't dodge when he blew this wide open. So he stayed, hauling parts, biting his tongue, his blood boiling every time Mark's shadow crossed the floor. The breaking point came late, past midnight, when Mark loomed over Martha again. She was back on the line, her face gray, her fingers slipping as she tried to keep up. "You're useless," Mark spat, loud enough for the whole shift to hear. "I'm cutting you loose tomorrow, pack your crap and go." Martha's head dropped, her shoulders shaking, and something snapped in Richard. He stepped forward, his voice low but cutting through the noise. "She's been here longer than you, and you're going to toss her like trash?" Mark turned, his eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, newbie? Say it again, I dare you." Richard's fists clenched, his helmet hiding the storm in his eyes. He could end it now, rip off the disguise and bury this punk, but he held back, the weight of the whole crew pressing on him. Just seems wrong, he said, rough and steady, stepping back into the shadows. Mark smirked, turning away. Thought so. Keep your mouth shut and your hands moving. The shift dragged on, the clock ticking toward dawn, and Richard stayed silent, his mind racing. He'd built this place on trust, on hard work, and Mark was tearing it apart piece by piece, person by person. Martha's quiet sobs echoed in his head. The fear in the crew's eyes burned into him. He couldn't just watch anymore, but blowing his cover now might tip Mark off, let him cover his tracks. How much longer could he stand it, playing the grunt while his own factory bled out? And what would he do when a mask finally came off? Hey, if you're wondering when Rick's gonna snap, his voice might have cut through if this were your screen. Tell us in the comments. Like this if you're mad for Martha. And subscribe, you're not done yet. The fluorescent lights of Collins Manufacturing buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across the factory floor as the third shift ground into its 10th hour. Richard Collins stood at his station, the weight of his borrowed helmet pressing down on his neck, his hands moving on autopilot, tightening bolts, shifting parts, playing Rick, the new guy, while his 58-year-old bones ached with every twist. The air was thick with oil and desperation, the crew's faces drawn tight under the strain of Mark Jensen's relentless pace. Martha was back on the line, her 62-year-old frame trembling as she hauled a stack of metal plates, her coughs cutting through the drone of the machines. Richard's chest burned, his patience fraying with every barked order, every flinch from the workers he'd sworn to protect. Mark strutted past, his clipboard slapping against his thigh, his voice a razor slicing through the hum. You're dragging. People pick it up or pack it up. He stopped by Martha, his sneer twisting into something uglier. And you, Grandma thought I told you to quit slowing us down. She didn't look up, just nodded, her hands fumbling with the plates. Richard's grip tightened on his wrench, his knuckles white under the gloves. He'd spent 3 days undercover now, watching this bastard turn his factory into a sweatshop unpaid overtime. Threats, old-timers like Martha worked to the brink. He'd built Collins Manufacturing on fairness, on loyalty, and Mark was pissing all over it, right in front of him. The breaking point hit like a snap cable. Mark leaned in close to Richard, his breath hot with coffee and contempt. Hey, newbie, what's your deal, huh? Standing there like some old geezer waiting for a bus. You're as useless as her. He jerked his thumb at Martha, who flinched at the jab. The words landed hard, a slap to everything Richard had poured into this place. He straightened, his heart hammering, the wrench clattering to the workbench. Say that again, he said, his voice low, rough still Rick, but with an edge Mark didn't catch. The manager laughed, stepping closer, his chest puffed out. I said you're a washed-up old man, both of you. Should have been scrapped years ago. That was it. Richard's hand went to his helmet, fingers curling around the brim. He'd come here to dig up the truth, to see how deep the rot went, but this wasn't just rotit was a cancer, and Mark was the tumor. He yanked the helmet off, letting it hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the factory. The mask came next, peeling away the grime-streaked disguise, revealing the sharp jaw and gray eyes of Richard coincidental, founder, the man whose name was stamped on every machine in this building. The room froze, a collective gasp sucking the air out of the space. Martha's hands stilled, the plates slipping from her grip. The kid next to Richard gaped, his wrench dangling midair. Mark's smirk vanished, his face draining to a sickly white. Richard Collins, someone whispered, the name rippling through the crew like a shock wave. Mark stumbled back a step, his clipboard slipping, his mouth working, but no sound coming out. Richard stepped forward, his work jacket open, his voice steady but blazing. So this is how you treat the people who keep this company alive all these years, he said, his eyes locked on Mark's. You think you can bully them, break them, toss them out like trash? The words hit like hammer blows, each one landing harder than the last. The factory went dead silent. The machines hummed the only sound as every head turned some wide-eyed, some nodding slow like they'd been waiting for this. Mark's throat bobbed, his hands twitching. Didn't know, sir, he stammered, but Richard cut him off, his voice rising now, filling the room. Didn't know? You didn't need to know who I was to treat them like human beings. He pointed at Martha, who stood frozen, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. She's been here since day one, longer than you, and you've got her collapsing while you play dictator. You're done here. Mark's jaw dropped, his eyes darting around for an escape, but the crew was closing in, not physically, but with their stares, their silence, a wall of judgment he couldn't dodge. The kid next to Richard finally found his voice, a shaky, "Holy crap," slipping out as he stared at his coworker. Martha sank onto a crate, her hands covering her mouth, her coughs quieting into sobs. The older workers exchanged look, shock, relief, a flicker of something like hope. Richard turned to them, his chest heaving, his disguise gone, but his purpose clear. I built this place for you, for all of us, he said, his voice softening but still firm. Not for him to tear it down. That ends now. He faced Mark again, pointing at the door. Get your stuff and get out. You're fired. Mark blinked, his face a mix of panic and disbelief. You can tell you don't have, he started, but Richard stepped closer, towering over him despite the years. I'm the CEO. I damn well can. Go. Mark hesitated, then grabbed his clipboard and bolted, the door slamming behind him like a gunshot. The factory stayed quiet for a beat, the weight of it all settling in. Richard standing there. No helmet, no mask, just the man who'd walked among them and seen the truth. Martha looked up, her voice trembling. Mr. Collins? She whispered, like she needed to be sure. He nodded, kneeling beside her. I'm here, Martha. I'm sorry I let it get this far. The crew erupted, then not in cheers, but in murmurs, questions, a slow release of the fear they'd carried. Richard stood, his mind racing. He'd ripped the lid off, exposed the rot, but this was just the start. Mark was gone, but the damage lingered, years of it, etched into Martha's hands, the kid's hollow eyes, the silence of a team too scared to speak. What would he do now to tear it all down and rebuild, or try to fix what was left? And how far would he go to make it right? The factory floor at Collins Manufacturing felt like a held breath the morning after Mark Jensen's exit, the machines humming softer than usual, the air thick with a mix of relief and unease. Richard Collins stood in the break room, his work jacket swapped for a crisp button-down, his 58-year-old frame still carrying the weight of what he'd uncovered. The helmet and gloves were gone, but the fire in his gray eyes burned hotter than ever. He'd ripped Mark out of the picture last night, fired him in front of the whole crew, sent him packing with his tail between his legs, but the mess didn't end there. Martha sat at a table nearby, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her 62-year-old face still pale from exhaustion. The kid from the line lingered by the door, watching Richard like he was some kind of ghost turned flesh. Word had spread fast, too fast. By dawn, the factory was buzzing with whispers, the crew trading stories of Rick, the new guy who'd turn out to be the big boss. Richard called a meeting right there on the floor. No suits, no boardroom, just him, the workers, and the truth laid bare. He climbed onto a crate, his voice cutting through the morning hum. I saw what's been happening here, he said, his tone steady but raw. Unpaid overtime, threats, people like Martha worked half to death. That's not what I built this place for. Mark's gone, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, a few claps breaking out. Martha looked up, her eyes wet but steady, and Richard gave her a nod back. He pulled out a stack of papers, notes he'd scribbled over 3 days, undercover, names, times, every ugly detail Mark had let slide. This, he said, holding them up, is what he did to you, to us, and it stops now. He tore into Mark's reign like a man gutting a fish shower's log without pay, safety corners cut, older workers like Martha targeted with insults and impossible quotas. The crew listened, their faces a mix of shock and grim recognition. The kid Tommy, Richard learned, stepped forward, his voice shaky. He told me I'd be fired if I took a sick day. Said I was replaceable. Martha nodded slow, her voice hoarse. Told me I was too old to matter. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. You're the backbone of this place, he said. Every one of you. And I'm fixing this. But the fix wasn't clean. By noon, the phone in Richard's makeshift officea cluttered corner with a desk and a flickering light was ringing off the hook. The board had caught wind of the shake-up, and they weren't happy. Richard patched in a call, his tie loosened, his voice sharp as he faced the crackling speaker. "You fired Jensen without a vote?" barked Hargrove, a gray-haired shareholder with a temper. "You're tanking morale. Collins Productions already dipping." Richard leaned forward, his knuckles white on the desk. "Morale's been tanked for years. Mark did that, not me. I saw it myself. Workers collapsing, scared to breathe. That's what's been killing us." Hargrove didn't back off. "You want to play hero? Fine, but you're talking raises, new equipment? That's millions we don't have. Stock's gonna drop, and we'll be the ones bleeding." Another voice chimed in, Claire, the CFO, her tone icy. "We can't afford this, Richard. You're risking everything over a few sob stories." Richard slammed a hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the line. "Sob stories? I watched Martha Keel over 30 years with us, and she's treated like garbage. This isn't risk its survival. We don't fix this. We lose more than money." The line went quiet, but he could feel their doubt, their wallets tightening from 3 states away. Back on the floor, the crew watched him hopeful, wary, waiting. Richard stepped out, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and pulled Martha aside. "You okay?" he asked, soft but firm. She nodded, her hand steadier now. "Better, knowing he's gone. But what's next?" He didn't have an easy answer. The board's pushback loomed like a storm cloud, and he knew firing Mark was just the first shot. He'd promised change, better pay, better hours, a factory that didn't chew people up, but the numbers Hargrove threw at him weren't wrong. Millions to overhaul this place. Millions he'd have to fight tooth and nail to justify. And if the board turned on him, he could lose it all: his seat, his company, the whole damn legacy. Richard walked the line again, his boots scuffing the concrete, his mind racing. Tommy fell in beside him, hesitant. "You really mean it? Things you'll change." Richard stopped, looking at the kid bags under his eyes, hands raw from the grind. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, "but it's going to be a hell of a fight. Stick with me." Tommy nodded, a flicker of trust breaking through the exhaustion. Martha watched from her station, her cough quieter now, her posture straighter. Richard squared his shoulders, the weight of their faith pressing down on him. He'd torn the mask off, exposed the rot, but the real battle was coming upstairs with the suits, not down here with the wrenches. The day ended with no word from the board, just a tense silence that followed him home. He sat in his truck outside the factory, the engine idling, staring at the silhouette of the building he'd built from nothing. Mark was gone, but the scars lingered: Martha's tremble, Tommy's fear, a crew stretched to breaking. Could he push this through, past the red ink and the shareholder gripes, or would they pull the rug out from under him? He gripped the wheel, his knuckles whitening. He'd started this undercover to save his people. Now it was him against the machine he'd created. The Collins manufacturing factory stood quiet under a gray dawn, the machines idle for once as Richard Collins paced the empty floor, his boots echoing off the concrete. It had been a week since he'd fired Mark Jensen in front of the crew, a week since the board's threats had crackled through the phone, a week of sleepless nights with Martha's trembling hands and Tommy's hollow eyes burned into his brain. At 58, Richard had built this place from a dream and a handshake, swearing it'd be different people over profit, loyalty over greed. Now, with the board breathing down his neck and a factory on the brink, he was down to his last play. He stopped by the assembly line, running a hand over the steel, and made up his mind. This wasn't just about saving Facete, it was about saving everything. The showdown came that afternoon in the boardroom, a sleek space miles from the factory's grit. Richard faced the suit's Hargrove, Claire, the rest his tie loose, his voice steady but fierce. "I've seen what happens when we forget why we're here," he said, slamming a stack of papers on the table, his undercover notes. Photos of Martha's collapse, payroll logs showing unpaid hours. "This isn't a sob story, it's a damn wake-up call. We've been bleeding people, not just money, and it stops today." Hargrove leaned back, his arms crossed, his face sour. "You're talking raises? Safety overhauls millions we can't spare. Stock will tank, Richard." Claire nodded, her pen tapping. We're not a charity. Richard didn't flinch. We're not a sweatshop either. I watched a woman who's given us 30 years keel over 30 years, and she's treated like trash. You want to talk numbers? Turnover's up, morale's shot hats your cost. Fix this, and we'll see profits climb, not sink. He pulled out a new plan: higher wages, overtime pay, safety gear upgrades, his voice rising. Ban every damn bully like Mark from this company. Starting now. The room went quiet, Hargrove's frown deepening, but Claire's pen slowed, her eyes flicking to the papers. Richard pushed harder. I'm not asking, I'm telling you. Back me, or I walk, and you explain to the shareholders why. It wasn't a bluff. He'd built Collins Manufacturing with his bare hands. If they couldn't see the rot he'd uncovered, he'd tear it down and start over. The silence stretched, then Claire spoke, her voice clipped. Run a pilot 6 months. If it flops, you're out. Hargrove grunted, reluctant but nodded. Richard took a thoughtful win, but a foothold. He left the room, his shirt damp with sweat, his chest tight. Back at the factory, he called the crew together again. No crate this time, just him, standing raw and open. New rules, he said, his voice carrying. Better pay, no forced overtime, no more crap from anyone. And Martha, he turned to her, her eyes wide. You're our new safety supervisor. Keep us honest. A cheer broke out, ragged but real. Tommy clapping, the older workers grinning, Martha blinking back tears. Richard exhaled, the weight lifting just a little. A year later, the factory hit a new high production up, turnover down, profits climbing past, even Hargrove's grumbling. The pilot worked, and the board backed off, Claire even cracking a rare smile at the numbers. Richard stood on a small platform one evening. The crew gathered for a quick word, his voice steady over the hum. Profit doesn't come from machines, it comes from you, he said, his eyes sweeping the room. I forgot that once. One again. Martha stepped up after, her new clipboard in hand, her cough gone, her posture straight. Never thought I'd see this, she said, her voice soft but clear. Thank you, Mr. Collins. He shook his head, clapping her shoulder. Thank you. Kept this place alive when I didn't. The crew dispersed, their chatter lighter, their steps surer. Tommy lingered, nodding at Richard. You meant it, huh? Richard grinned, faint but real. Damn right. The kid walked off, a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Richard stayed late, alone on the floor, the lights dimming as the day wound down. He'd gone undercover to check on his people, found a nightmare, and fought like hell to fix it. The scars were still there, years of Mark's damage wouldn't fade overnight, but the factory breathed again, alive with something closer to what he dreamed all those decades ago. He thought of Martha's collapse, the board's pushback, the moment he'd ripped off that helmet. It had been a gamble, but it had paid off not just in dollars, but in trust rebuilt piece by piece. Money's nice, he might have said if he were talking to you now, but it's the people that matter. How many leaders out there are missing that? Tell us your take in the comments. What would you have done? Thanks for sticking with this one. Hit like if it got you, subscribe for more, and drop a thought below. We read them all. Catch you in the next story.